Aunt Elle's Stories. Elsie Lee Lowe, born September the 4th, 1906, and she left us on July the 30th, 1986, at the age of 79. She married Everett Blue Henderson on October the 29th, 1927. Everett was born on June the 13th, 1906, and he left us on June the 19th, 1994, at the age of 88. They lived in Greensburg, Kentucky, their whole lives. Jumping the rope. One Sunday afternoon, when we were courting, we was sitting out on the stair porch, and the little boys were jumping the rope. And Dad had started to milk. He said, "Let me jump the rope." So Austin and John and Floyd and Lem Patterson were through with the rope. So Dad started jumping, and he let one slip before us all. Homer and Emmer and Everett and all the other boys. So Daddy, he just got out, and he went to milk. When I was a child, I was called a preacher, and one day we were at our grandmother's and someone asked me to preach. So I began to preach. I was close to a flour barrel. I put my fingers in it and put flour on my face. My grandmother, she didn't see me get the flour, so she got scared and called Annie Lowe, her daughter, and said to her, "Make her quit preaching. She is white in the face and she is sick." My grandmother's name was Mrs. Will Henry Bagby, Elsie Lowe. Crying and laughing. Once when I was little, I went to the store and I stopped by to see Cousin Betty Hatfield. So she asked me to preach for her. I would if she would give me some cake. Then I began to preach. Cousin Betty was a big hand to cry. I said something in my preaching that made her cry. When I got home, I said to Ma, "I sure did make the stars come out of Cousin Bee's eyes." I meant to say tears. So Ma, she began to laugh at me. Elsie. Weaning the baby. When the time comes for Mama to wean the baby, Johnny, it made me feel very sad. Of course, when the milk come into Mama's breast, Johnny would begin to get hungry. The old saying is to stick the poker in the fire and get it red hot. and then mix up the milk on the stick, and this would help to dry up the breast. Of course, I was little and didn't understand, and I would be holding Johnny in my arms, and to see her burn that milk and let the baby have it, oh, how it would hurt me. And I would snug him up closest to me. Elsie. We have to have a little fun through life. Before I was married, I was making and washing the butter. And I said to myself, I'm going to do something to make my mother mad. So I fix up my butter so pretty. And I put my sweetheart's initials on the butter. E.B.H. I called her to the kitchen and said to her, look how pretty I fixed the butter, Mama. You bet I really had to make a different design on the butter. Elsie. Sunstroke. One day, we were down on the branch in the bottom chopping out corn. Our mother had always told us not to get too hot. We began to get a little hot. And someone suggested that we should go and get water from the spring was closest, and then we went. Austin was a little boy, and Emma was very mean. One of us looked back at Austin and said, you are hot. We believe you have a sunstroke. Of course, we didn't know anything about sunstroke, but we'd always heard Mama talk about that. So we began to get scared and getting pretty white in the face. And we laid him on the ground by the spring, and we began to gather big green leaves and dip them in the cold water. Wrap him up from head to foot. So he began to get cold. Then he got mad. So the leaves began to fly, and he jumped up, and he got over his sunstroke. Elsie. My Grandpa Bagby. One time I was helping Grandpa worm tobacco, and he caught a big worm and said to me, I will give you a nickel if you would bite this worm's head off. So I thought, how quick I could make a nickel, and it would be an honest nickel. So I said, hand it to me. I put the worm in my mouth, bit off the head, and I spit it out. So Pa had to come up with his nickel. Elsie. Entertain old timers. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson. I had the pleasure of entertaining some of the oldest residents in the Thurlow community for dinner at their home recently. They were Mr. Stan Stacy, 85, Mrs. Dove Wharf, 85, Mr. Ellie Henderson, 77, Mrs. Ellie Henderson, 75, one of Everett and Elsie's school teachers, Mrs. Lucy Gupton, 61, and Mr. Bradley Gupton, 60. Others who visited them in the afternoon were Mr. and Mrs. Noah Nagels, Mr. and Mrs. Abe Finn, Mr. and Mrs. Kenneth Nagels, and son Don, Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Vernarsdale, and son Denny, Mr. and Mrs. Omer Risen. Young folks present were Marie, J.C. Kinney, Margaret McMahon, Catherine Jeffries, Clyden Jeffries, Mary Helen Pruitt, Annie Jane Ennis, Kendall Ennis, Robert Ennis, Bobby Jeffries, Billy Jeffries, John Allen McMahon. Music and singing was enjoyed. Elsie. My dad in his sick days. My dear old dad, Bob Lowe, was so sweet in his last days. At times, he wasn't at his right mind. So I was up there waiting on him. And one day, I put some paper down around him. He stayed in a chair most all the time. So I put the paper all around on the floor. And one day, I was sitting by him, and he just cut loose spitting. And I said to him, "Can't you spit in the pan?" And I reached down to get it for him. He said to me, "This is my line. I'm not spitting off the line." So I laughed at what he said, and then he laughed at me. We had a good time together as long as he lived. I fed him the last thing he ate that he loved so good was oyster soup. I believe I will meet him someday in heaven. Elsie. Just a few funny things in life. One time, Elsie and her little brother, Johnny Lowe, went to water the mules. She was on one, and he was riding one. They had a big hole just under a little hill to water the mules. And Johnny's mule began to trot, going down the hill. So when he get to the hole, he stopped and ducked his head to drink, and off Johnny went over in the hole. Then he began to cry, and Dad, he then began to holler, "What the matter?" "Oh, he just fell off in the hole," was the reply. The Children of Bob Lowe. You never know what will happen. Our daddy did a lot of trading. One day he had a trader. He told the fella that the mule he come to trade for was so gentle that the children could ride him. So he put Austin on the mule, show him how he could ride him. The rest of us children was down on the roadside playing. Our cousins, Mamie and Bertha Bagby, was playing with us. So we saw Austin a-coming. We ran out, throwing up our hands, clapping hands, and jumping, doing everything we could do. And we scared that mule, and he threw Austin. And Dad liked to have got a bunch of us kids. Elsie. A child never gets too old without his daddy's help. When we were children, Daddy carried us out chopping the corn. So we got tired and sat down to rest. So all of us had our own hoe. And Johnny, he got my hoe instead of me telling my dad to make Johnny to give it to me. I thought I was so grown up that I would just get my own hoe. And on to Johnny I went. He gets mad, and so did I. We had a pretty good fight on, and Dad, he just stood on laughing. And I began to feel like I needed my dad's help. So I began to call upon him for help. He just led on and kept on, and I finally did get the hoe. But from that day on, I didn't want to tackle Johnny anymore. Elsie. You never know when you might hurt someone's feelings. One night, after we were married, we'd all gone to visit in the afternoon. So we come in home, doing up night work. I said to my mother-in-law, "What are we going to have for supper?" She answered, "Mush." I said, "Well, what is mush?" So she laughed and called her husband and said, "What a silly daughter-in-law we got. She don't know what mush is." and that hurt my feelings. And I went off to bed without any mush and cried all night. I called Everett in the night and told him that he had to hunt us a home. And he got out in a few days and rent us a home. Elsie. The old black home. I went to visit my neighbor, and on my way back home, I found a black comb. I picked it up and brought it home. It was a good comb. And at that time, good combs was hard to find. I laid the comb downstairs on the dresser. So one day, I missed the comb, and I just look and look, but no comb could I find. So weeks and weeks passed on. So one day, I needed a rag for something. I kept them upstairs in a box. I went up to get a rag, and while I was looking for a rag, there I saw the old black comb. I said to myself, the old black comb. Someone has broken it and hid it in the old rag box. And that somebody was little Annie Jane Ennis. My little sister and I. When we were at home, our jobs was washing dishes and churning. Mine was dishes, Emma churning. One morning, I began to wash dishes, and I thought I would make my little sister Gracie dry them for me. So I called on her to come, but she refused to come. I said, I bet you do dry them. So she said, I won't. Then I started after her to make her. She started to run. She run down on the road, way down. Then I finally caught up with her. I gave her a little whipping and carried her back to dry dishes. When I got back to the house, there was Emma, all stirred up. And she jumped on to me. After all, I had her to whoop, but we finally had our little battle. Then we went on with our work. This is something that older children get into when they have to take a mother's place. Mama, she was sick in bed. I imagine before we get through this, we were having a good time. It's the way it goes with children. Elsie. School days. When we were little girls, we sometimes would play in playhouses at school. We built all of our furniture out of rocks and planks. So us bigger girls was beginning to think we were grown, but we was still playing in our own little playhouse. And the big boys would come around to see us. And one of the boys, all of our girls was so struck on him. His name was and he come by one day to see our playhouse and all of our furniture looked alike to him. He sat down upon a piano. I said to him, "Get off that piano right now." And he said, "Well, way to play one." And he jumped up and laughed and said, "Is that your piano?" Elsie. Our first night to trim toenails. The first night we married, we went to S.V. Kessler's to stay all night after supper. And we went to visit one of his aunts alone about 8 o'clock. Went back to his sister's, so she carried me to the room that we were to sleep in, and I went off to bed. After a while, E.B. come up to the room. I was in bed. He didn't say anything. I didn't say nothing. So he sit down in a chair, took off one shoe. After a while, taking another one off. So he'd taken his knife out of his pocket. So I wondered, what are you going to do with that knife? So he began to trim his toenails. So he just trimmed and trimmed. I thought to myself, I wish you would hurry up and come to bed. For I was laying there shaking like a leaf, and I wanted to soon get my scared over. So he finally put up his knife back in his pocket, then put the light out, and then he began to undress. Then he crawled slowly in the bed. After a while, We spoke a few words. To make a story short, I think he killed the nerves in his toenails. Hasn't grown any since. Elsie. Another time in life on the farm. One night I said, "We got a little calf." So E.B. went to get the cow and the calf to put them in the barn. I went on about doing my night work, and E.B. had put up the cow and calf in the barn. And I saw another one. I began to holler. I said, "Everett, have another calf." The old cow had found 2 twin calves. She had hid one off, but the other calf let itself be known when it missed its mother. Elsie. An old-time experience was this. When Brenda Sue Rising was born, Elsie Henderson, her aunt, went over there to help see after her sister and the baby. So the baby cried most all night. She was hungry next morning. The old aunt said, "I'm going to feed that baby." Omer, the daddy of the baby, went on, put a biscuit in some warm, sweet water, and gave it to me. So she fed it to the baby, and she went off to sleep. So they called Dr. DeSimone to see the baby, and the mother told him how the baby was. Though it was asleep, she told him that the baby had been fed on sweet water and biscuit. He said to the old aunt, "It a wonder it don't kill it." "The baby was hungry," I said. And she went off to sleep. So the baby lived and done very well. Elsie. Just 2 little mean girls. Once, when Emma and I were girls, we would have chickens. So we had our chicks, our own tobacco stick coop to feed our chicks in, under the sweet apple trees. One day, we went out to feed our chicks. I got to my coop first. Then I began to feed them. And some of Emma's chickens come over to my coop. Then she come over there trying to catch the chickens. And she began to pick up some of mine. I thought, huh. I reached down and picked up a board at the coop, hit her across the back. Then she began to scream just as loud as she could, let on like I really hurt her bad. So I did get scared, for I really didn't know how bad I'd hit her. Mama, she come on screaming and give both of us a whipping, which we both did needed. Elsie. Children. 3 children out playing in their playhouse was Elsie, Emma, Austin Lowe. Their brother Austin would tear up their playhouse. So once they were out playing in their playhouse built under an old apple tree. And the oldest girl, Elsie, she thought she would put a stop to her brother Austin tearing up the playhouse. So she called her sister Emma and told her all about it. Under this tree was some old roots come up through the ground that grew up and crooked back. She called Austin and said to him, "We were taught that this is a bad omen. So she said, "Here is the old fod man Fingers. He coming through the ground after you." So he began to scream, of course, and I felt sorry for him and told him he would not tear up our playhouse anymore, that he would go back and wouldn't get him. So this plan sure did work, Elsie.